Hello and welcome to my talk for the Tucson Herpetological Society. This is a re-recording of my talk from about a month ago, and it is on the life and death of the flat-tailed horned lizard. I would like to thank my co-authors, Allison Hawkins and Matt Good, for helping out throughout this study and putting together this talk. I would also like to thank everybody who helped on the project out in the field, all the field crew and volunteers, as well as some people out where we worked at mcallii. Also our funding sources, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of the Interior, BOR, Department of Defense, and as well for logistics, the University of Arizona, SMRE, and the Marine Corps Air Station out in Yuma. So today I'll be talking about the flat-tailed horned lizard. I'll talk about two parts of our study, one part on loggerhead shrike predation, as well as reproduction. And so the flat-tailed horned lizard is a small Phrynosoma lizard. Their range includes Mexico, Arizona, and parts of California up in here. If you're interested in seeing how these populations kind of came about, I know that someone had a question in the question part afterwards. You can look at a paper by Pawlicki in 2006 where they talk about the phylogeography of the flat-tailed horned lizard. And currently in California and Arizona, this species is state listed and it is federally listed in Mexico. The range over time used to be a lot bigger, filling up this whole area, but we're kind of only restricted to Yuma, this area near El Centro, and up here near Ocotillo Wells. And I think there used to be a couple of individuals up in Palm Springs. There might still be. But the range has been reduced over time, usually by human activities from development, usually agriculture, and they're kind of only on private land now that is federal or state land. They have been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act 4 times, but one of the big things that has helped stop them from being listed is the range-wide management strategy put together by the Flat-tailed Horned Lizard Interagency Coordinating Committee. They do a lot of work to help fund flat-tailed horned lizard research, as well as fund the continued monitoring effort for flat-tailed horned lizards to look at how the populations are doing. So they're a pretty small lizard. Adults, this individual right over here is the biggest that we got was slightly over 8 centimeters in length. And we have some hatchlings here and then a subadult over here. They're a pretty grumpy looking lizard, but they also can be adorable and they're small enough to fit in your pocket when you catch a couple out in the field. They're a myrmecophagous species, meaning that the vast majority of their diet are ants, as the individual is showing right here. This was a little hatchling that I caught around an ant pile, and I was processing another one that I'd caught and looked up, and it was just eating right in front of me. As you'll see, he'll go and eat some ants and then do a little push-up. We had a little discussion in the question part about why they're doing push-ups, but nobody truly really knows. One of the big things for this lizard and their main way to defend themselves is just through camouflage and staying out of sight of predators. So they're the only horned lizard that has a dark vertebral line, as you can see on this individual, and it really helps them blend into the surrounding area. It's supposed to mimic a plant stem shadow. And you can see their like little speckling and their coloration on their back really helps them blend in with the surrounding soil. And as you can see, this individual is slightly buried and they are really, really good at burying themselves in the sand. This individual comes very close to burying itself completely, but does a pretty good job with just a little horn out there and a little bit of the back. There's actually an individual over in this photo over here. You can see some tracks coming in from the side here and then coming down. I can tell you it's not in the upper half. I'll give you guys a couple more seconds just to see if you can figure out where the lizard is at, or you can pause the video. And the lizard is actually right down here, buried itself mostly in the sand with its head still sticking out and that dark vertebral line. But it's fantastic camouflage for them out there. It makes it a little bit trickier for us to find them. So we did our research out in Yuma, Arizona, down here in the southwestern corner of the state. And we worked predominantly on the Bureau of Reclamation land out here and then the Barium Goldwater Range as well to the south of Yuma. Out there was a lot of flat aeolian sand, which makes it really, really easy to follow the horned lizards. And parts in California, it's what we call hardpan, which has barely any sand on it, and they really don't leave tracks on it, which makes it a lot more difficult to actually spot the lizards. This picture was taken in 2019 after some good winter rain, so there's a lot more plants out here than there usually is. Usually it's a lot more open, with just creosotes being the dominant plant species. But when we're out there, we are following their tracks in the sand. They leave these really, really nice scratchy tracks, and you can see exactly where they're going. And hopefully at the end of it, there is a lizard just sitting out on the surface. This species, even though they're small, we find them a lot with injuries, and they seem to be pretty hardy because, as you can see, this individual has a chunk completely taken out of it. Should pretty much be feeling like that on the body. So there's a good amount out there that have these injuries or broken legs, or legs that are just gone, but somehow they just keep on soldiering on. And they do have a lot of predators out there. Just to name a few are the sidewinder rattlesnake, the coach whip, kit fox, and the round-tailed ground squirrel. The fun thing, if they are eaten by a snake, there's potential that they can kill the snake even after they've died. As the snake is swallowing the horned lizard, the two large parietal horns right at the back of the head, if the snake isn't swallowing the lizard correctly, those can actually puncture through the snake's skin and kill the snake. But the main predator we're going to be focusing on for the first part of this talk is the loggerhead shrike. And we wanted to see kind of what impacts loggerhead shrikes are having on flat-toed horned lizard populations, and hopefully they aren't just decimating them out there. Shrikes can be found throughout the world, as you have a bayback shrike from India right over here, but we get them right in the States, as you see this loggerhead shrike with a moth in its mouth. The current distribution of loggerhead shrikes in the US is pretty widespread. They're found throughout the desert Southwest down here, but some populations in the northern part of the range are struggling a bit. And one thing that's magical that they do is they'll pin their prey onto barbed wire or just sharp sticks. Here's that moth from the previous slide that the shrike had. But they'll do it to moths, they'll do it to lizards, small lizards like this one. They'll do it to desert iguanas, other birds, and it's just amazing, the whole suite of things that they'll eat. And so they catch the prey on the either barbed wire or creosote usually, to have it for later. So they'll usually have their cache sites around either the center of their activity area or their nest. And that just gives them easy access to food if there are ever times where it's tough for them to actually catch prey. And they would also make a great horror movie villain, as sometimes their caches can be a bit spooky. And they're also called butcher birds because of them caching their prey items. And it seems like they really like human structures. It's real nice and easy just to catch something on this barbed wire, but it also gives them height to be able to scan the area below for any potential prey items. Usually they're going to be found near these areas just because of that added height, but we do find them occasionally out away from human structures, but they liked barbed wire fencing, signs, telephone poles, anything that can give them that additional height. And so to kind of determine and find shrikes, we drove the road and drove all the roads out there, sand roads, paved roads, with structures, without structures. we did about 2,500 kilometers in 2016, 2017, and we found a handful of birds, but it wasn't a ton of them. We were mostly focused on surveying for flat-tailed horned lizards at that time. When we were out surveying, we found that significantly more shrikes per kilometer driven were found on roads with structures than roads without structures. And back in 2011 and 2014 in Matt's lab, they did surveys along a road that had power poles in some areas and then areas without, and they compared the relative abundance of loggerhead shrikes and flat-tailed horned lizards between those. And there are significantly more shrikes and less flat-tailed horned lizards on the section with power poles compared to the section without. So it seems like there's possibly an impact going on there. And so when we were out driving, we would find the shrike and then try and follow them to their nest. Usually it'll try and lead us away from the nest, but we usually kind of look in the area right around where we're finding the shrike or where they're moving to, just to see if we can find that nest. Occasionally they were in ironwood trees, which is where they're at is pretty much the tallest thing out there, but then they were also found in creosotes. Even though we found about 18 potential pairs, we only found 5 potential nest sites. 3 of those were successful nests where the hatchlings fledged out, 2 were failed, and then we also had one site that we used as a control just around a creosote. And we did surveys for flat-tailed horned lizards, density of creosotes, and density of cache sites within a circle around those nest sites or the control site with a radius of 150 meters. And so in those, we never found any live flat-tailed horned lizards, but we did find plenty of cache sites. Each plot ended up having a cache site, and we found about 25 individual flat-tailed horned lizard caches during our surveys, and still never found any live individuals out there. So it seems like right around their nest sites, they're having a good impact on flat-tails, but that impact might go further than 150 meters. In 2011 and 2014, they were tracking almost 400 flat-tailed horned lizards out there. And they had a good amount of predation events out there, but one individual they're trying to find the frequency for, and they could not pick up the transmitter at all. And so they were driving around and eventually started to pick it up near this gravel pit at the edge of the Barium Goldwater Range, and ended up finding the head of the flat-tailed horned lizard, a shrike pellet, and then the transmitter on top of this machinery up here, which was about 500 meters away from the center of the activity area for this horned lizard. So it seems like the shrikes might go out much, much further than 150 meters to get their prey. And they can definitely have a large impact. In 2016, this weather ball is located close to where we do our surveys at, or we call it the white ball, and it's just a weather station. It's right off one of the highways down there. And in 2016, Matt and Allison found 96 skulls on the barbed wire fence around there. And some of these still have limbs on them. Some of them are still just little skulls or little skull fragments. So could have possibly been over a couple of years. But 96 horned lizards is a lot for shrikes to be taken out. And so this study was kind of tough to do because we were mostly focused on flat-tailed horned lizards, and I'll talk about the focus of our main focus of the study in the second half of this talk. But it's tough to tell the impact of shrikes without having research pretty much just on the shrike, trying to have a team just dedicated to following them around, figuring out where their nests are, and then having the other research group go in and figure out how many flat-tailed horned lizards are in the area, what are the cache sites like, and all that. So we have a little bit of a view on them, and it probably would be best out in the range of the flat-tailed horned lizard not to be putting up too many human structures, just to kind of deter loggerhead shrikes. In Arizona, they're doing pretty good population wise. So we don't really need to be putting up human structures to promote their population growth. Whereas we should be trying to help out the flat-tailed corn lizard in the one small pocket of Arizona that they're left in. And so while it's kind of tough to tell the impact, we did see one impact on our reproduction study, which I'll talk about right now. But we did have one predation event, which was by a loggerhead shrike. As you can see, this individual coming back to take its prey item after we had taken it off of a creosote just to dissect it and verify that it was indeed a gravid female and that she did have ova. But that is a pretty decent snack for a loggerhead shrike right there. And after it's about to fly off, our technician Allison went out a little bit afterwards, and all she could find was the head and then the dorsal side of the flat tail, just with the transmitter still left on it. So at least they aren't eating the transmitters, which is good because that would be a little expensive. So our study on reproduction was a lot more successful than the shrike study, because this is our main focus. From 2017 to 2019, we surveyed for flat-tailed horned lizards on the Barium Goldwater Range, as well as on the Bureau of Reclamation land, with one of the goals being to search for gravid females. And so during that time, we captured just under 1,400 individuals. It was pretty even between males and females, and then pretty even among the size classes. So our adults were pretty much any individual that is over 65 millimeters in length from their snout to their vent, and that based on the literature, the current understanding where adults start to become reproductively active. We had 394 subadults and 477 hatchlings. Of our about 1,400 individuals, we recaptured 336 of those individuals. So another goal of the study was to get genetic samples. So we also went back out in 2020 to determine the effect of a road out there as well as a highway. And we're also looking at some landscape genetics that could be incorporated into long-term genetic monitoring of flat tails, but I'll talk about that later. So when we're going out to find the horned lizards, whenever we got an individual, we would take a couple of measurements: mass, snout vent length, tail length, horn length. And if we found a female, we would palpate her for ova. This individual here is very easy to see that she has ova. As you can see, these nice round structures along the side of her belly. So she has some pretty developed ova right there. Usually we'd have to palpate just to feel whether it was an ova or if it was just her stomach fulvant, which is pretty easy to tell the difference between the two. But if we did find an individual that had ova, we put a transmitter on them. We also put transmitters on individuals that we found that were courting each other. So right here you have a female being courted by a male on the road, not the safest place to be courted, but we would bring them back to wherever we were staying at and process them and then place a transmitter on the gravid female. Occasionally even happens when we thought we had a gravid female and then she was courted by another male. So we saw this happen a handful of times, and one time we even saw a very, very small male trying to court a female. So this male right down here is only about 57 millimeters from the snout up here to the vent at the base of the tail, versus the female is over at 77. And as you can tell, that's about 8 millimeters less than what is currently thought to be the cutoff for reproductive size. So this is just an interesting note that maybe they're able to reproduce at a much smaller age or much smaller size than what was originally thought. We also had some individuals where we saw some mating events happening even when they had the transmitters on them, which was really, really nice to see. But after we would put a 1.4 gram transmitter onto the individuals, we'd hold them for 24 hours just to have that epoxy dry or the glue and then we would track them 2 to 3 times a day. And so in 2017, we tracked 29 different females. 3 of those we tracked twice, and we tracked the same number in 2019 as well, with only 1 of them tracked twice. In 2018, we only tracked 16 individuals. It was not a great year for reproduction. As you can see, we only found 1 nest versus in 2017 and 2019, we found a lot more nests. Occasionally, the lizards would shed their transmitters off before they laid their nest, which was a little unfortunate. And initially, we determined that they laid their nest, but just by taking their weight every single day. But eventually, we saw that they were moving out of their normal activity areas and going pretty decent distances. So this individual here, this is pretty much her movement patterns every time we're tracking her. She pretty much stayed around 1 burrow, just centered right around here, and then she's going to move a couple 100 meters to the north to lay her nest. She pretty much used, I think, only 4 different burrows for the whole time that we were tracking her over a couple weeks. But she's about to shoot straight up north there. This is her nest burrow up here. She spent a couple days in there and then shoots right back, just straight back down to her nest burrow. And I even followed her tracks just from the nest to her normal burrow, and it was pretty much as straight as it can possibly be. Here's another individual that has a slightly larger activity area based around here. And occasionally we saw some potential exploratory movements in them laying their nest burrows, as she's going to shoot out over here to the east and an exploratory movement, and then come back and shoot up around over here. And this area right there, yep, was exactly where she laid her nest. So it seems like they might be selecting something within the soil or something in the surrounding area that would be best for their nest. And we saw this happen with a handful of individuals. And when looking at these movements, they are actually a lot further, significantly further than their regular movements, as they went all the way up to about 460 meters from the center of their normal activity area. And normal movements, the furthest was 93, but we're mostly around 25 meters between the 2 sites. And after they laid their nest, we also noticed that they were doing an interesting behavior by backfilling their burrows and leaving these scratch marks that kind of look like the sun's rays around their nest burrow. This happened the vast majority of the time with the nest that we found, and hatchlings ended up only emerging from nests that were backfilled. And we were lucky enough to be able to get some time-lapse footage of a female laying or backfilling the burrow. It's unclear if they backfill all the way up to the top of the burrow, but they're definitely doing it on the surface here. And it's thought, or we think that it's possibly just to spread out the scent of the eggs, possibly, because there are patch-nosed snakes out there that love to eat lizard eggs, and there are tons of flat-tailed horn lizards out there, so it's probably unlikely that they're just going to try and key in on an adult horn lizard. So her taking all the sand around might just take away the scent of the eggs underground there. And we didn't just see this with flat-tailed horn lizards. It seems like it's being done by both fringe-toed lizards and zebra-toed lizards, or zebra-tailed lizards. The fringe toes we did find one individual in 2018 that came off of this area that seemed like it was buried and possibly was a nest. I just came across this marking that looked a lot like a flat-tailed horn lizard nest burying, and followed the tracks and found an adult female fringe-toed lizard buried in the sand nearby. So she may have just laid her ova. And over here, after a while, we started to see the burying marks throughout our surveys, and we would just mark the location of the nest and then put a nest enclosure around there. And in 2019, we actually got 2 nests to produce little baby zebra tails. So the zebra tails are definitely doing the same kind of backfilling. The fringe-toed lizard seems like it is, but this nest never ended up being successful. And so I told you that we put enclosures, so we just utilized metal flashing and tried to have a decent radius around the nest site just to try and catch as many hatchlings as possible, as we didn't know exactly where they pop up and related to the entrance to the burrow. So in 2017, we had 19 total nests, 14 of those were buried, and we had 8 successful nests. 2018 was a really, really poor year. I'll talk about reasons for that later. But we did find 4 random nests out there, which is kind of interesting, but none of them ever produced anything. And then in 2019, we had 24 nests, 19 of those were buried. 8 of those were random, but 2 of those ended up being zebra-tailed nests. And then we had 8 successful flat-tail nests. At the end of 2019, we also had 7 potential late nest burrows, but I think that none of them were successful because there was a cold snap out there. After a while, you kind of get a hang of when a nest is probably successful just based on kind of the area and the behavior of the female and her condition. And at least 4 of those seemed like they were going to hatch out, but none of them ever ended up hatching out just because of the drop in temperature, possibly. But after a while, then you eventually get little babies coming out of the nest, and they usually stayed within a couple feet of the entrance of the burrow. But we ended up having 64 hatchlings emerge from these 16 total nests. So our clutch size is a little bit smaller than those previously noted in the literature, but those are looking at the ova within specimens versus ours is successful hatchlings that emerged from the nest burrow. So there's possibilities that there were some ova in there that didn't hatch out that we didn't find when we dug up the nest burrows. We also measured the hatchlings when they came out, and they were about 1.4 grams and about 30 millimeters snout to vent length. We did have one clutch of 4 or 5 hatchlings that were all up above 2 grams and at least 35 millimeters snout vent length. So I don't know if that female is just great reproductive condition or it's genetics or just a great area. But her hatchlings definitely had a head start compared to the rest of them. And so we also wanted to document how long it took between the individuals laying their eggs to when they emerged. And it's about 6 to 7 weeks. We had a difference between 2017 and 2019 in terms of days to hatching. But 2017, all the nests were found on the Barium Goldwater range, and then in 2019, the vast majority were found on the BOR, and so they're a bit different. The BOR land is a bit more higher shrub density than there, so there might be other factors at play with the soil that we haven't been able to look at yet. And then our date the first hatchlings were found. So in 2017, we were moving around a lot in the BMGR, and we found our first hatchling in mid-June, which means with about this number of days for them to hatch, they would have had to lay in early May, and we're probably breeding sometime in April, maybe early to mid-April, to be able to bring their ova enough to be able to lay their eggs. And in 2019, we're pretty much only on the BOR, occasionally going out to Barium Goldwater as well. But we had a much later day, and it seems like the flat-tailed corn lizards are kind of, the females are in each area are kind of gravid at the same time in their specific area. It doesn't seem like it's probably predator swamping. It seems like it's more just based on the resources in that small area. So when we were moving around in 2017, we were kind of constantly finding individuals of hatchling size, which are all in this yellow box, just pretty much throughout the whole time. Versus in 2019, it definitely seemed that it was just, we get a bunch of hatchlings and then it go like a month until we get another bunch of hatchlings. And you can see that the individuals were hatchlings were pretty constant throughout time. And flat-tailed horned lizards have been documented to double clutch and lay 2 nests in a year. And we had one individual which seemed like she might have double clutched, and a couple others that definitely did lay 2 clutches. We also, if you note here, we did have a clutch that hatched out in early November, which is the latest documented. It was on November 2nd. And if our nest in 2019, our late ones were successful, they would have pushed to the end of November by the time that they hatched out, which would have been super, super cool to see. So I told you about how 2018 was a really, really bad year. So when this is a graph of SVL classes and then percentage of lizards in those. So you got your hatchlings kind of down here, subadults here, and your adults over here. So the green and the red are 2017-19, the blue is 2018. So you can see 17 and 19 have this bimodal distribution where you get good amount of hatchlings and then adults, not really too many subadults in there, versus 2018 is just pretty much subadults and adults only. And so one thing that we were thinking might be winter rainfall. And so these are the winters going into that year. So going into 2017, good amount of rain out there. Same thing with 2019. 2018 was the worst recorded winter precipitation since all the way back in 2002. So that may be a reason why we had tons of subadults out there, pretty much no reproduction. It was super, super easy to find lizards out there just because the water table was so low that anytime there was rain, it would just sink right into the ground, versus in 17 and 19, if it rained, it would take a couple days for that water to get down so the sand could reset, and then you'd have tons of tracks out there. So 2018, ironically, was our best year to find total number of lizards, but our worst year reproductive wise. So it's kind of interesting, just looking at numbers only might not be the best way to do it. We also did some minor work looking at dispersal of hatchlings after they have merged. So we saw that the gravid females will do dispersal to lay their nest outside of their activity area. We wanted to see if the hatchlings are doing a second dispersal event, and it seems like they kind of are. We only were able to do it for 2 nests and only had a couple individuals that we tracked for a handful of days, but we would catch the hatchlings and then process them and put this little bit of plastic on the edge of their tail with super glue that would fall off eventually, and that would help us distinguish their tracks from other hatchlings around there. And then we go try and track them after an hour, and then the next day, and then the next day after that, until we just couldn't find their tracks anymore. And so after one day, they moved about 25 meters from the nest and moved anywhere from 6 to 95 meters. As you can see, these larger movements of individuals out there. And after, I think the longest we were able to follow hatchling for was 2 or 3 days. And after that, they had moved about 40 meters, and with the biggest movement being over 100 meters, being this individual out here and this individual over here. So they definitely seem like they're starting to do a second dispersal, and we even saw potentially a third dispersal mechanism, because in July of 2017, we found a decent sized hatchling, and then we relocated that same individual in 2018. It had moved 3 kilometers between those 2 dates. So that definitely seems like they're able to move very long distances if they need to, and that they can have multiple dispersal events throughout their life. So another way to look at dispersal is part of our genomics work, looking at relatedness by distance and seeing how the flat tails are kind of used in the area, and if it's all just one giant population, they're all just mixing together, or if there are more isolated populations. We also want to look at paternity and have it be a part of the study, just to see how far the males are coming from, who the males are that are reproducing. If there's a couple dominant males in the area, it doesn't seem like they are super protective of their areas and kicking other males out. But we'll see with how the paternity analysis goes and seeing where the males are coming from and if there's even multiple paternity. Another thing that we want to look at is landscape genomics. So looking at the impacts of a couple roads. So flat-tailed horned lizards aren't the best with roads. Their main defense, as I said, was camouflage. So sometimes they'll just get onto the road and then sit on it. And that doesn't work very well for cars, especially with Border Patrol out there. But luckily, a couple of them are ready to take on Border Patrol and they're speeding out there. And road mortality is probably the biggest threat. But through the paternity analysis, we're also looking, hopefully going to find out more through that. And our biggest thing is our genomic monitoring. So looking at how populations are changing over time and looking at effective population size and a bunch of other parameters that we can build into our population viability analysis models, and hopefully be able to learn a lot more about flat-tailed horned lizards from that. But the paternity analysis, the biggest thing I want to see is if you can have the male with one of the hatchlings and see if they can have everything the light touches is our kingdom moment. But hopefully the circle of life doesn't end with them cashing on a creosote. Awesome. Thank you.